The topic today then is global international relations, and what I'm going to talk about, in a sense, is based on the speech I gave as the president of the International Studies Association in Toronto in 2014. Every ISA president, ISA stands for International Studies Association, gets to choose a theme around which his or her presidency is built. That's the agenda the president advances. And usually it's something that reflects the work of that person, the president, over a period of his or her career. And in my case, I chose the theme of IR theory, but particularly this idea of global IR. So I'm going to talk about what is the traditional IR and what are its problems, and then what is global IR and what are its main elements, and then I'll talk a little bit about some of the challenges facing global IR or the realization of global IR. Now you all know what international relations is about in the traditional sense. So there is a long history of writing about international relations. Often international relations is seen as a branch of political science that deals with relations between states and increasingly non-state actors. But what is not often said is the origins of international relations, which is deeply embedded in Western history, so much so that it can be called either an American social science, as the late Professor Stanley Huffman put it, or at most a Western social science. So the standard narrative about the origins of international relations is that as a field of study, it is said to begin or to have begun in the United Kingdom. But it really developed in the United States. In fact, University of Wales in Aberystwyth in United Kingdom was supposed to be the birthplace of international relations, according to at least one narrative. But even though it was born in the UK, it really developed in the United States, so much so that Professor Stanley Huffman, who passed away recently, called it an American social science. And according to this standard narrative, international relations reflects the values, the practices, the principles, and the behavior of Western countries. In fact, the modern period of international relations is said to begin with the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. And this is very common in textbooks to say that the state system, the modern international system, the principle of sovereignty, which is the bedrock of modern international relations, began with the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, when Europe developed the idea of the sovereign nation state. And as the European countries started colonizing the rest of the world, with the expansion of the colonial empires of European countries, that European state system, based on Westphalian principles of sovereignty and other principles, related principles, also spread. So what was the European state system became a global system. And especially with decolonization, the newly independent countries simply adopted European norms, European institutions. And that was reflected in the practice and theory of international relations. So, European state system became the global international system or the global system. Then came the era of American dominance. After 1945, United States replaced Britain as the global leading power in the world. And it was in the US, in keeping with the rise of the United States, that international relations developed its true sort of personality. Its theories, its methods were substantially developed in the United States. Of course, there was a European heritage, but the American context, the American institutions and scholars, which really developed this field. So most of the theories, such as realism, liberalism, constructivism, they all have a very strong American stamp on them. But generally, whether it's Europe or the United States, international relations reflects its origins in the Western historical context and Western institutions and principles. The non-Western countries have very little space or place in this narrative. The non-Western countries simply inherited from the European colonial powers the principles and institutions for international relations. They simply were born into a system that was already developed by the Western countries. So that is kind of the traditional standard narrative of the field of international relations. What are the problems with this? Well, the problem is that it's only partially correct. This standard narrative is partially correct. It all depends on what we mean by international relations and how wide we want to define its scope and the subjects and the areas that we study in international relations. So a counter narrative to the standard narrative would be that international relations was not invented in the West, nor did it begin with the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. By the way, the Peace of Westphalia in 1648 was not only the birth of according to the traditional narrative, was not only the starting point of modern international relations, but you can also say that it was also the beginning, or it is at the beginning of the rise of the West. So the kind of political structure, the principles, sovereignty, equality of states, and the absence of any higher authority above the state, so the idea of anarchy, they all came about in that period of the 17th century, and at the very same time, Europe was also rising and expanding worldwide. So the period of Western dominance and the beginnings of the Westphalian international system kind of coincided in an interesting way that not many people have actually written about. But the issue is that this standard narrative of IR doesn't capture the behavior or the practices or the histories of other and older civilizations, whether it's India, whether it's China, whether it's Islam, the like. But these civilizations also pioneered different international systems and world orders. World order here means how these civilizations viewed the world, how they organized their own foreign relations to achieve stability, prosperity, and progress. So, standard narratives of international relations do not capture the contribution and role or in the place of these non-Western civilizations and their ideas about international relations. Mind you, the term international is problematic because it means inter-nation state. And we know that the idea of nation state came about with the Peace of Westphalia. To that extent, the standard narrative is correct. If we define the field as international relations in a very literal sense, then you can say that it had to do with the origins of the nation state. And that had to do with Westphalia. But why should we limit our study of international relations to only the nation state, even if there is this definitional issue? If international relations is relations among states and societies and peoples, how countries and peoples and states relate to each other, even though we keep the term international because it's a standard, it has been used for a long time, we just keep it as a heritage concept. But we don't include only nation states, we include also empires, we include civilizations, we include societies. Our goal is to study how states and societies and civilizations relate to each other. If that is how we define international relations in a very broad way, then there's no reason why we should begin with the Peace of Westphalia and ignore the contributions of other civilizations. And mind you, even with the Peace of Westphalia, even with the birth of the nation state, there were still empires. With the birth of what is called anarchy, the anarchical international system of the Peace of Westphalia, we still have hierarchical international systems or world orders. And this is not just in Asia. It's not just only Asia had empires and West had states or nation states. Well, it is true that we had the Chinese and the Indians, the Qing dynasty, the Mughal dynasty in India, the Ottoman Empire. These are imperial systems. These are not nation states. But Europe also had empires. Europe had even bigger empires, global empires, colonial empires. The British Empire was the largest of them all. So it's not like Westphalia did away with the hierarchical international relations embedded or found in empires. So it's a bit of a myth that Westphalia changed the whole concept of international relations. In fact, the fact is that throughout history, both anarchic systems like Westphalia, and you can bring in the warring states of China and other periods in history in other parts of the world as well. The anarchical systems have coexisted or succeeded by or accompanied by hierarchical systems, meaning empires and colonial empires and the like. So, Westphalia did not completely, fundamentally transform the nature of international relations, but that is the kind of myth that this was the foundation of international relations, as if everything changed from that period. In fact, even after Westphalia, we had empires in the West. We had Austria-Hungary, Austro-Hungarian Empire. We had, if you include the Russians as part of the West, well, the Russian Empire. We had the British colonial empire. We had the French colonial empire. So both in the West and the East and the rest, we had hierarchical systems, and Westphalia did not change that. So in that sense, all the more reason why international relations should not be limited, the study of international relations should not limit itself to study of only anarchic systems that resemble like Westphalia. What international relations scholars do, when they try to bring in some of the non-Western civilizations, they look for equivalence, counterparts, or Westphalia-like international systems. So, as I said just now, the warring states period in China, where a bunch of states were fighting for hegemony, leading to the establishment of the first Chinese empire. They say that is kind of an antecedent. That's a precedent for the modern international system. They will include the Greek city-states, which are also competing in an anarchic way, and they would include that as the true progenitors, the true antecedents of the modern international system, and then they will ignore the rest. When there was an empire, when there was a traditional sort of feudalistic order, that will not be part of international relations. But that's very narrow and very questionable because, as I said, you find hierarchical systems and empires both in the East and the West. It's not like Westphalia removed all hierarchical systems and only left the anarchical systems. So we need to take a very broad view of what is international relations. Even though the term international is problematic, but we keep that term for the sake of convenience. Some people might call it world politics or global politics. Each of these terms have problems because global politics or world politics is about politics, but international relations is not just about politics. It's also about economics, culture, and the like. So there is no satisfactory term, but I have decided I will keep talking about IR because it's a sort of term of convenience, even though not 100% accurate. So the counter narrative that I am proposing is that international relations should broaden its scope. It should look at the world, not just the European world or the expansion of the European state system, but also international systems that existed in other parts of the world. It should draw its theories and concepts not only from European or American or US history, but what is called global or world history. It should look at not only anarchic systems, but also hierarchic systems, meaning empires. It should look at not only strategic interactions, but also economic interactions. And that is a very interesting point, because a lot of IR scholarship, at least initially, was about diplomacy, statecraft, and strategic interactions, war and peace. That was the bread and butter of the study of IR. Actually, political economy only came recently. The subfield of IR that we know as international political economy, of which globalization and all are a part of, that's relatively new. Although it is expanding quite rapidly, interest in those political economy of international relations is expanding, but it is relatively new. Traditional IR is very much focused on issues of war, peace, and diplomacy. If you do that, then basically you tend to focus on the winners of this game of war and peace. And those winners for the last 400-500 years have been mostly Western countries. But if you bring in economics into the picture, then the scope of what we study in international relations expands. And you can then look at many other cultures and civilizations making a contribution. Just to give you an example, Islam. Well, Islam never had a global empire. Of course, you can talk about the Mughal Empire. It's a very large empire. You can talk about the Ottoman Empire, which is a multinational empire spanning Europe, Middle East, parts of Asia. It was nothing like the British Empire or the French colonial empire, but still a pretty large empire. But Islam did not have really a global empire like the British or the French did. What Islam did in a sense, is the major contribution of Islam really was to invent what we call globalization through economics. Of course, the Muslim countries, Muslim rulers conquered territory. So Islam, the Arabs particularly, from the Caliphate in Baghdad, did conquer North Africa, parts of Europe, and went right up to Spain. But they did not come to East Asia. They did not come to, they didn't conquer Indonesia. Although Indonesia now today is the largest Islamic country in the world, and they had political strategic influence in India, but it was not necessarily always by conquest, it was always also by trade. So Islam's means of expansion was through trade rather than mainly by conquest. And Islam invented globalization. from Spain to Indonesia, linking the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean, linking Africa, Europe, Middle East, Asia. The first time a truly global economy was established by Islam. But if we don't study economic interactions and we focus only on strategic interactions, then we ignore the contribution of Islam. And that's what happens in traditional international relations. By ignoring or giving less emphasis to economics and more to strategic and political interactions, we tend to marginalize the contribution of non-Western societies. Of course, not all theories do that. The world systems theory of Immanuel Wallerstein, in fact, focuses on the global economy. And in fact, it's accused of going to the other extreme, focusing too much on economics and less on politics. But the point I'm making is that economic interactions make the study of international relations wider and allow us to focus on the contribution of non-Western countries. You can also talk about the trade network in Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean, linking Middle East, India, and China, right up to Japan and East Africa on the Indian Ocean side. Now, it was partly the handiwork of Islam, but it was the handiwork of Southeast Asian traders, the Javanese traders, also the Hindu traders of India, the Chinese traders who came down to Southeast Asia and Indian Ocean. So for thousands of years, this was the maritime Silk Road. This was a very vibrant part of the world, and that economic linkages, especially between India and China through Southeast Asia, contributed to the spread of ideas, including political ideas, religious ideas like Buddhism and Hinduism, and also to political institutions, especially the spread of Indian political ideas into Southeast Asia. So why isn't this international relations? China was a major empire traditionally, not global, but a regional Asian empire. But China also had a very strong impact on Europe, not because of China conquered Europe, but Chinese inventions and Chinese products, but especially Chinese inventions, had a profound impact on the industrial revolution of Europe. And also the expansion of Europe, discovery of Europe. Things like paper, compass, gunpowder, they helped Europe to expand globally and develop this colonial system. But if we study China mostly in terms of war and peace, then we don't appreciate those ideational contributions China made to world politics. So the point here then is that to study international relations, we must go beyond the study of war and peace, or political and strategic interactions. We should also bring in ideas and economics. Then you get a chance to think about how other civilizations have contributed. The international relations become less Western-centric. And we should also look at regional interactions. Not everything is global. There are very distinct regional systems, state systems, civilizations, which actually become an important part of international relations. So just think of the South American civilizations, Mayas and the Incas, which were basically destroyed by the Spanish colonialism. The Mayas and Incas are very advanced in science and technology, and also they had their very sophisticated political systems, stratified social and political systems. But they were regional. They were not global civilizations. They're not global. We cannot call them a global political order or international relations in the global sense. But just because they were limited to Central America and Peru and the Andean region doesn't mean we should ignore them, and we should only focus on everything that has a global influence. So one of the biases in international relations is that it tends to look at ideas and institutions that have a global scope or global impact. So European state system became a global system thanks to colonialism, and that's what we study. The Westphalian model became the global model because of colonialism, and we focus on that. Traditional IR focuses on that. But if you look at regional systems on their own merit, and you'll find that not only in South America, the Mayas and the Incas, but also in South Asia, in East Asia, in Southeast Asia, in Africa, there are regional systems which also functioned, which also had developed their own principles and institutions. And why should we ignore those? Just because they were not necessarily globalized. So that's also another bias in traditional international relations we should address. So we need to rethink what international relations is and what should be studied under it. And this is becoming more and more salient, more and more urgent, because the world is changing. Of course, the West was dominant for hundreds of years, but the period of Western dominance is coming to an end. Some might say it's already ended. With the rise of countries like China and India, which were really the big powers in the pre-colonial period, it is even more necessary to pay attention to these non-Western cultures and civilizations. It is important with the rise of Islam, for good reasons or bad reasons, in good ways and bad ways. The fact that there is a process of reawakening in Islam around the world also demands or makes it necessary that we pay attention to the Islamic world order and its origins and contributions, and not just stereotype Islam today as the source of terrorism, because Islam had made a major contribution both to the preservation of classical knowledge of the Greeks, but also the development with their own contribution of Islamic scholars and scientists of science and technology and philosophy. In fact, Islam was the most advanced civilization in terms of science and technology, maybe even philosophy, during the medieval period when the West was in the Dark Ages. And we can say that Islam was really the bridge between the West and the East, because in the Middle East, it's a center of gravity in the Middle East, enabled it to draw from the ideas of China, India, Egypt, Greece, and synthesize them, add significant original contributions of its own, and then create a body of knowledge that played a very crucial role in the making of modern Europe, including the European Renaissance. Although IR textbooks very seldom acknowledge this, because they're not interested in history, they're not interested in ideas, and they tend to ignore non-Western civilizations and cultures. So, in that sense, what I'm leading to is that international relations is best understood as the product of interactions and mutual learning between all civilizations and states, even when some of them have been more powerful than others at different stages in history. If you look at the rise and fall of civilizations, and this is a very crucial point, the West has been dominant at most for 500 years, but it's probably less. But we have a history of 5,000 years. So if you look at international relations from Westphalia, meaning from the perspective of a nation state, we have 400 plus years of history to go with. And during that period, the West has been dominant. But if you study international relations from a civilizational perspective, we have 5,000 years of history to study. Going back to the Sumerians, 3000 BC, or even beyond, further. And during that 5,000 years, many civilizations have come and gone. Different civilizations have achieved dominance and have contributed at their own time, in their own way, to the overall human progress. The Sumerians invented a lot of things, astronomy and even science and technology, the wheel. Indians contributed to mathematics. The Greeks and the Romans at their time were quite intellectually, especially the Greeks, intellectually very vibrant, made a lot of contributions. So did the Persians. Then, of course, the Chinese, major source of innovation in the world. So of course, they didn't stay constant. Those contributions did not persist forever. They came and went. But if you look at, if I was teaching this course, say in 11th century AD, and there was a subject called International Relations. Just imagine, I was giving this lecture maybe in Cordova in Spain, which was the capital of the Islamic Caliphate of Spain. I would not be talking about, Westphalia. I would not be talking about the European countries. I'll be talking about what happened in the Middle East and the questions of trade. I will be talking about Aristotle and Plato because Muslim philosophers translated Greek texts and preserved them and added their own commentary, which then was repatriated, retranslated into Latin and French and become part of Western knowledge. I'll be talking about Plato and Aristotle, but I'll be talking about a lot more things which happened in the Middle East, which happened in India, which happened in North Africa and the like, and also in Europe. So international relations will look very different. So, because Islam was the dominant philosophical and economic force of that time, in a sense, it was more global than China. China was very powerful, but China was kind of intensive, a little insular. Islam was extensive. It spread and it linked the West and the East. It was the bridge. So I'll be talking about contributions of Islam. I'll be talking about, of course, China, India, and the like, and the Greeks and the Romans. But today's international relations rarely talks about anything but the West. It only talks about Mediterranean, the Greek-Roman, then Europe, Westphalia, the European state system, American foreign policy. And that needs to change, and that's my point, that IR is best understood as the product of interactions and mutual learning between all civilizations and not just one. And the process of learning was a mutual learning. It was not just that the West borrowed from the West. The West borrowed a lot of knowledge from the West, from Asia, including science and technology, but also some aspects of statecraft. The West was fascinated by Chinese ideas, Indian ideas, Islamic ideas. But it was not just science and technology or medicine, it was also political and philosophical ideas. And that process was a process of mutual learning. And that mutual learning is sorely lacking in today's study of international relations, which has become a one-way street with Western scholarship and Western institutions and theories derived from that Western context dominating the field. So let me just pause here for a moment if you have any questions, and I'll pick up and then talk about how do we remedy this situation? How do we build a discipline which takes into account, which addresses all these issues and gaps that I'm talking about? And that's what I call global IR. How to make international relations truly global. At the moment, it is not, and I will talk to it about it in a moment. Any questions?